what's been proposed. One such recent incident was in RSU4, where when a proposal to subcontract bus services was on the verge of being accepted by the board, the union intervened and during its review of the contract found that the district had put the wrong amount of total miles out to bid, which would have resulted in substantially more cost to taxpayers if the subcontract had been accepted. So the subcontracting did not take place. The final point I'll make is that public employers offer a unique employment scenario in regard to subcontracting, because the taxpayers not only fund the school budget, for instance, but also fund the various governmental support systems for the underemployed and the unemployed. The predominant reason for subcontracting is to reduce costs, which results in the worker performing the work being paid less for performing the same work as was done before the subcontract. And this is usually significantly less, as there now is a need, a room for a profit margin, as well as being less costly. In a school setting, the object of subcontracting is almost always the educational support personnel, who are the lowest paid members in the district to begin with. Big corporations like Walmart have been in the news for paying wages at a level that allows its employees to still qualify for various social programs, effectively shifting costs from the corporation to the taxpayer. While this may make sense in business from a boosting the bottom line perspective, albeit at taxpayers' expense, in the public sector, a savings to one taxpayer-funded entity just shifts costs to other taxpayer-funded programs, leaving a net effect of close to zero, while reducing available living wage jobs and the tax base. As one arbitrator opined, it doesn't make sense for a district to place its own employees in the unemployment line of the state in order to boost its fund balance for future exigencies. Such cost savings merely shift expenses for such employees from one group, the district, to the taxpayers of the state. Leaving this subject as a matter of bargaining allows this weighting process to occur with all impacted parties' voices being heard, not only bringing a fair result for employees, but for taxpayers. This isn't building in search of a problem that doesn't exist. There's nothing more related to wages, hours, and working conditions than the question of if the job is performed by a bargaining unit member or a non-employee. Wages, hours, and working conditions are moot in the absence of a job. And I know clearly this is coming about as a result of Scarborough. I happen to be the advocate on the association side in the Scarborough case, and I just wanted to make sure, since we're talking specifically about that, some facts were on the record, and you know that were the basis for the arbitrator's decision. You know, first at the hearing there, Superintendent Entwistle testified that the expectation of the quality level for custodial services would not diminish from present with the subcontractor. That was his expectation. The staffing in Scarborough had recently been reduced by 3 custodial positions, had been eliminated in FY12. And towards the staffing levels, Entwistle had testified that I presume custodial services hit the tipping point in terms of what they can reduce. Custodial services had hit what they needed in terms of resources, and we couldn't touch it anymore. We weren't reducing square footage or buildings. And in fact, Scarborough had added a new building and had to add 2 more custodial staff within the last year. Further, there was no evidence provided that the subcontractors had more efficient delivery services or processes to perform the required work. To the contrary, there was testimonies of duties that aren't clearly listed in the response for proposals, and issues with familiarity with buildings, systems, and people that will hinder efficiency for a subcontractor. Given that quality levels were expected to remain the same, current staffing cannot be reduced further in order to meet the expected quality levels of the district, and there isn't expected to be any efficiency gains from subcontract. That's what came out at hearing. And in fact, inefficiencies were likely to occur. I mean, it can be deduced from that the current staffing levels need to be at least maintained in order to meet the district's stated required result. That, however, was not what the facts were. There were, at the time, 1,193 hours per week being worked by custodial staff in the district. There were 3 proposals that were given. The proposals ranged from a low, and these also follow the cost of the subcontract, of 930 hours per week. One subcontractor said they were going to provide 930 hours, which was 263 hours less per week. Another one said 1,040 hours, and then another one said they would need even more hours per week to do the same facility, 1,320. And all of them arrived at their estimate using, quote, industry standards. And so there was, and not all those contracts, frankly, were cheaper. So there was a real question of if there was, in fact, savings, or if there had just been a low ball bid in order to get into the district, that additional costs were going to come later, or quality was going to greatly suffer. It also came out that this is just the contract cost. There's also other indirect costs that go along with the subcontract in terms of monitoring and transaction costs. And in the Public Administrative Review, which is an industry journal, they say that these services routinely cost 20% of the total contract. And there's a direct trade-off between the level of investment and oversight and the level of compliance with the contract. So that was another issue there. And finally, this, in terms of savings, the savings clearly came directly out of the paychecks and benefits of those who would be doing the work. The currently average hourly rate in Scarborough is $14.40 an hour, which is kind of middle of the pack for custodial services in the Mid-Coast. And these folks who were coming in were going to be paid, depending on the contract, between $9.54 an hour and $10.75 an hour. As well, the health insurance, as all employees in Scarborough have, is an 80-20% premium split between the district and the employees. With this, the contractors didn't say what exactly they were going to be providing, but they were going to provide some insurance, and depending on the contract, they're going to provide, on average, between $1,731 to $2,418 per employee, which doesn't necessarily get you that far in terms of insurance coverage. And it's one of those things. I mean, this potential savings, which we argued and apparently argued effectively in front of the arbitrators, didn't exist, is less than 0.01% of the total budget in Scarborough. And the issue of student needs is always raised, and every teacher, every educational support personnel in the state is there for the students. There's no doubt about it. But this is always, when it's raised, what are the facts behind this? And some of the questions I asked at the time, and I'd ask again, is if a decision such as this is going to be based upon student needs, what is the lesson the superintendent and the board are teaching the students of the district? That a potential savings of less than 0.01% of the total budget is worth the loss of financial stability and viability for those who work for you. That those who labor in tasks that many wouldn't perform for all the money in the world, including public restrooms, aren't deserving of a job that pays a living wage so they can pay their mortgage and maintain health insurance so they can continue to be healthy. That basic moral and ethics and how to treat our fellow humans can be dismissed for a potential pittance of savings. I don't believe the reasonable person, parent and taxpayer, would have a hard time accepting these as appropriate lessons for a place of learning to teach our children. And finally, Title 26, Chapter 9 of the statute sets forth as the purpose of public policy in the state in the Municipal Public Employees Labor Relations Act to promote the improvement of the relationship between public employers and their employees, to allow the unfettered subcontracting of unit work, which this proposal would do, would frustrate the stated purpose of the Act. There no longer would exist a relationship between the public employer and its employees, as there no longer would be public employees in these positions as their subcontract. Thank you. And MEA recommends that you vote ought not to pass on LD 1010.
Thank you. Any questions for Mr. Representative Stetkis?
Thank you, Madam Chair. You supplied a ton of information just now. That was great. Do you know who the contractor was with the lowest bid on that?
Yes, I do know names.
Okay. Have they been in business more than a few months, a few years? Okay. Is it possible that they have invested money in equipment that may be newer or substantially more efficient than the equipment that's presently used by the staff?
I mean, there was no testimony given, no facts that came in at hearing of that.
Thank you.
Any other questions? We heard testimony about Auburn. They had a similar process, and in the end, apparently, it was ruled that they were within their rights to outsource their busing. So was it because, did Scarborough make some sort of a mistake in their contract negotiations where they left it, where they closed that up so that you could not separate the custodians from the teachers' contracts? Is that essentially my understanding of what happened?
I'm not sure because we don't represent the bus drivers over there. There's another union that represents them.
I'm not talking about the bus drivers in Scarborough.
No.
Just comparing the two cases.
In Auburn. No, I'm saying I'm not aware because we don't represent the bus drivers over in Auburn.
But if you don't represent the bus drivers in Auburn, that says to me they were not part of the MEA.
Correct.
Correct.
They were part of another union.
Okay. So they had a separate union, whereas the custodians in Scarborough were represented by the MEA, essentially operating under the same contract as the teachers. So what happened is that you can't split a contract. Is that my understanding of what the difference is between why Auburn was allowed to do what they were allowed to do and Falmouth is allowed to do what Falmouth is allowed to do, and apparently, according to Representative Fecto, Biddeford is allowed to do what Biddeford has done, but yet Scarborough, for some mysterious reason, is not permitted to do so.
Right. So in Scarborough, there are 4 different bargaining units. MEA is affiliated with all 4 bargaining units. The bargaining unit this occurred in is just custodial and food service staff. But I mean, it turns on a contractual question of what the contract language looks like. We don't represent the bus drivers over in Auburn. That was a separate unit over there. We do have other units within Auburn. My understanding is they had different contract language that allowed it, but I'm not the right person to answer specifically there.
Thank you. I think you answered the question. Any other questions? Representative Mastracchio?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So it sounds to me, though, like one of the reasons, and it will be helpful for us to see that decision, because it sounds to me like that decision was based on the fact that absent saving money or having better service or some of the issues that you have to negotiate within the contract the way we have for so many years, you can't just do that in order to get rid of a union. Because in the end, that's what could happen if you were negotiating and having a difficult time as management. If I was on the school board and we were sitting down face to face, you could just say, well, we'll privatize you, and then you'll be gone and goodbye. So this is just a protection, because if you value that service, and it shouldn't be about that kind of decision. You're not making the decision, you're making a decision based on what's best for your community. And as a representative of the union, you understand the need to save money. I mean, I'm sure you hear that when you sit down and negotiate. And everybody, and we all pay taxes, including every single person that works for the school district. So I guess if Dr. Entwistle can't get it, we'd really like to see that decision, because I think it will be clear that it was not the contract language, but in fact the reasons that they wanted to privatize. That will become apparent, and I'd just like to see it.
Sure, no, absolutely, I can provide that decision.
Thank you.
Any other questions from the committee?
Thank you.
And so now, Mr. Slobon, you are up.
Good afternoon, Senator Volk and members of the committee. My name is Matt Schlobohm. I'm the Executive Director of the Maine AFL-CIO. I'm proud to state from the beginning that I have never bludgeoned anyone. I do work for a labor union, believe it or not. So on behalf of our 40,000 working men and women, we would like to testify against all 6 bills before you today, and I guess now that's technically all 5 bills. You've heard a lot. There's a lot of folks patiently waiting to say more, so I will try and stick to the high points. I think the summary of our opposition is that taking as a whole, the 6 bills before you are quite literally the most far-reaching legislative effort to undermine collective bargaining rights and unions that we've seen in recent Maine history. The impact of these bills would be to dramatically undercut workers' ability to come together and bargain for a better life, and to dramatically undercut unions' ability and their core mission to improve the lives of working people. And it is no understatement to say that these bills undermine unions as we know them and undermine collective bargaining as we know it. And the metaphor I would use if someone wants to push back on that is if you have a car and someone comes along and cuts the brake lines and takes off the wheels and removes the transmission, you technically still have a car, but it's not able to do its mission, it's not able to do what it's intended to do, and we see these 6 bills as a package doing that to unions, trying to undermine their core ability to stand up for workers, provide good representation, ensure that people have a voice on the job to stand up for safe workplaces, decent paying benefits. There's also a really strong economic argument against the bills before you. When you actually look closely at the data, and if you do real research, and I would be the first to acknowledge there's junk science and kindergarten math on both sides of this. I can go and say, oh, Mississippi has this, so that must be because of right to work. No. But when you actually look at the data and do a regression analysis so you control for all the other factors, the best study that's been done on this, which controlled for cost of living and 41 other factors, found that on average, full-time workers, both union and non-union, earn $1,558 less. That's a 2011 study from the Economic Policy Institute. It's done by the nation's top labor economist in the country right now, who works for USDOL. I'll provide it at the work session. It also found that the likelihood of getting employer-based health insurance decreases by 3%, and the likelihood of having an employer retirement pension program decreases by 5%. So the impact of these measures, most specifically the so-called right to work bills, would be to drive down Maine workers' wages and to take money out of people's pockets. I don't think that is the way any of us should go. The third summary point I would make is that current law is actually a compromise, and I think it's been vetted a lot and pushed around and fought over, and the law basically says that no one's required to join a union. Unions are required under legal doctrine to represent all members, regardless of whether they're members of that union or not. And thus, if a union and an employer can agree, and I would stress, if an employer agrees to it, you can put a clause in a contract saying people are required to contribute strictly for the cost of representation and nothing else. That, to me, seems like a reasonable compromise. The fourth summary point I would make in opposition is that this bill sends a terrible signal to working people across the state. We've talked to lots of our members who work in firehouses and hospitals and classrooms and mills, and their question is, why are you doing this? Because the message that's sent here is crystal clear. If you're a firefighter bargaining for safer equipment and a safe community, what you're saying is you're the problem. If you're a teacher that wants an adequate amount of school supplies and you want to do that through a bargaining process, this says that you're the problem. If you're a worker that's trying to keep work in the state at the shipyard, the underlying message of these bills is that you're somehow part of the problem. And I don't think working people feel like they're part of the problem. I think they actually feel like they're part of the solution. Just a word on the legal background and context, because I think if I had a nickel for every statement that made my eyes bug open this morning, I think I would have heavy pockets right now. So union membership, and I just want to try and get a lay of the land so that we're all operating from the same page. Union membership is voluntary in Maine and every other state in the country. That's been true for the last 7 decades. No one is required to be a union member. So that's point one. Under federal law, unions must represent its members and non-members equally and without preference or discrimination in dealing with their employer. Unions are bound by a duty of fair representation. That means they're required to represent members and non-members equally. I've given you all the statutes where that and all the case law that backs that up. But essentially, you can not be a member of a union. In a right-to-work state, you cannot contribute a nickel, and still have full access to the wages and benefits game, the just cause protection, the arbitration and grievance process. And you can actually sue the union if they don't take that up for you. So if I'm a non-member and I feel like I was fired because the boss wanted to give his brother the job and the union doesn't give me its due diligence, I can sue you for not fairly representing me, despite the fact that I'm not a member of my organization, of your organization. To us, that doesn't seem fair, and we think the current statute is actually a fair compromise around that realm. And then, so if unions and employers can agree, and again, any employer that doesn't want this in its contract doesn't have to put it in there. It's something that happens at the bargaining table. Non-members can be required to contribute a small portion of the cost of strictly representation. They don't have to pay dues. They pay a small it's called a fair share clause, a union security clause, and it's limited to the cost of bargaining contract enforcement. No politics, no organizing, no community involvement, no charitable work. And a private sector employer has no legal obligation to recognize or deal with a union that doesn't represent a majority of workers. So as you know, a right-to-work law criminalizes the inclusion of those kinds of clauses. It makes it illegal for any group of employees and employers to require that everyone who benefits from a union contract pay their share of the costs. In our estimation, the motivation behind these laws is very plain and simple. It's twofold. One is to weaken unions, and secondly, it's to drive down wages. And the logic, the argument that you hear about we'll be able to attract more is fundamentally based on that premise. It's based on we don't want workers to have a voice in the workplace, and we want lower wages. And I think if you dig underneath it, what you'll find is that that's what these kinds of bills actually fundamentally do. And I think, to sort of move it out of the weeds of labor law and the inside baseball of union contracts, I think there's a simple analogy that sort of lays bare the problems of this kind of legislation. You all represent towns and communities. If we pass laws that said in Rumford or in Scarborough or in Bangor, you can access all the municipal services you want. If your house catches on fire, pick up the phone. If you have a dispute, you need to call the police, call them up. If you want to send your kids to school, by all means, have at it. If you like your road plowed in the winter, it'll be plowed. But paying your property taxes and contributing is completely optional. I think we know what would happen to our towns. They would be drained of resources and they would become less and less functional. That's the fundamental goal of these kinds of bills. You can have all the Trojan horses you want about individual liberty, but at the end of the day, it's to try and weaken workers' organizations and undermine their ability to function. That's what this is ultimately about. So we're opposed to the provisions contained in these bills because they violate a basic fairness principles. Unions are required to represent everyone fully, fairly, and equally. Everyone gains some benefit from the action of the whole. Thus, it seems only logical and fair that everyone bears the cost in some form. I talked a little bit about the economic arguments, and I think the key thing here is that you have to hold everything else equal. And when you actually do that rigorous analysis, and again, there's a lot of kindergarten math on both sides, when you actually do that analysis, is what you find is that states with these laws, workers have less money in their pockets to the tune of about $1,558 a year, and they're less likely to have health insurance and a pension. I would ask you, why is it that we would want to go down that road? And I think there's also a series of false arguments that are trotted out. You hashed out the economic attraction arguments, but I would just point out that the Area Development Magazine, which is a non-political publication, that's the magazine of the site location industry. It does a survey every single year of all manufacturers and asks them, what are the most important factors to you in what state you choose to go to? In all the years this survey has been published, right to work has never ranked anywhere in the top 10. And I think you all know what the real issues are. To me, it doesn't pass the straight face test that a union security clause in a contract is going to determine whether a business comes to Maine. We're also opposed, and I'll touch on them briefly here because I know you're tired and ready to move on. We're also opposed to LD 404, LD 1010, LD 1319, and LD 1351 is no more. So briefly on those, LD 1010, I would just echo the sentiments of Mr. Bettee. I would also clarify this bill applies to all public sector employees. This is a huge issue. The Fairpoint strike in the private sector was about the ability to have unlimited rights to subcontract out work. At Bath Iron Works right now, workers are standing up and saying, you need to actually follow our contract if you're going to try and sub out massive portions of our work. I don't see why public employees shouldn't have those exact same rights. And this really feels to me like an end run around bargaining and a sour grapes. We lost an arbitration, so we're going to try and come back and change the state law. And I also found it particularly troubling that proponents seem to want to create a second class of citizenship so that custodians or bus drivers shouldn't have the same bargaining rights that other people have. And that to me just seems wrong and inappropriate and disrespectful to people who do very, very important work. LD 404, almost all of our members pay their union dues through payroll deduction. It's the 21st century. It's an efficient and easy technology. It's negotiated in contracts as to whether it's permissible. And just as lots of workers make charitable donations, just like they make loan and bill payments, it is dumbfounding to our members why you would want to prohibit them from paying their dues through a payroll deduction process. It's been used everywhere. I would also just caution that it may very well be unconstitutional. I think you're on very shaky ground there because the bill seeks to silence and punish unions. We're not applying that standard to anyone else. And we feel like it unfairly targets police officers, firefighters, nurses, teachers, etc. In terms of LD 1319, I think that this is a collective bargaining issue. And if municipalities or the state want to say that people shouldn't be able to be compensated in any way, shape, or form to self-govern and run their organizations, then bargain it at the bargaining table. And I think it also is designed to undermine public bargaining, collective bargaining.